Hello and welcome to the Choralosophy Podcast, a weekly podcast whose mission is multifaceted. Each week when you tune in, you will find episodes that question best practices, challenge music education dogma, facilitate conversations about touchy topics, demonstrate pedagogies, and conversations where colleagues learn from each other. This is episode 258. Crafting Identity Through Music with Shruthi Rajasekar. In this edition of the Oxford University Press collaboration with the Choralosophy Podcast, I am very excited to bring you Shruthi Rajasekar. We explore together the vibrant fusion of Carnatic and Western classical music through the eyes of a composer who crafts her identity into every note in a landscape of music that she exists in, which is in two worlds all at the same time. Shruthi shares her journey of improvisation and cultural expression in the type of music she learned growing up, which was oral and improvisatory, but also living in the United States, learning Western classical music right alongside. I found this duality to be fascinating, and I've been exploring it a lot lately, as you might have noticed if you're a regular listener. Shruthi was a wonderful conversation partner and had some very interesting insights to share about her own creative process. She even flipped around and asked me questions on occasion. We also discussed the importance of cultural identity in music in general, the role of the tonic or do in Carnatic music, and the intersections of different musical styles. Shruthi emphasizes the collaborative nature of music making and the significance of community in choral settings. We also get into her beliefs about how literature impacts her work, as well as politics and how she works the issues of the day into her compositions. So this Oxford series episode is awesome. I am super excited to collaborate with them again on this episode, so enjoy and stick around all the way to the end. Once you've listened and you have your own ideas, in particular, if you have ideas to share about multiple cultural musical frames of reference that exist in your own life, that's something I'm really interested in general. Come over to the Choralosophers Facebook page and tell us about that. I would love to ask you more questions, and I'm sure more of the community there would like to hear from you as well. Choir directors, music educators, show planners, you pour your heart into your music. Shouldn't your events get the same attention? That's where Ludus comes in. Sell tickets, promote your concerts, and fundraise with ease. Selling merchandise and concessions? Ludus Retail makes in-person sales effortless. Running choir camps or workshops? They have a classes feature that keeps registrations simple, and when you need help, the live support team is ready to pop up with real answers from real people. The best part? It's completely free for organizations. Thousands of music programs already trust Ludus because great music deserves more than just a ticketing system. If you haven't already, I really think it's time for you to ditch the bulky sight-reading books, the paper, all of the things that are already in the kids' folders in your classroom because it's not customizable to what they need in the moment. Sight Reading Factory allows this and so much more, including auto-assessment for at-home assignments, no more grading them individually. They can be graded in the moment. So use the Choralosophy checkout code, Choralosophy. When you check out, it'll give you a 10% discount every time you get a membership for yourself and for all of your students, which is really, really important so they can do this at home. I'm not sure how much, if anything, out there has not gone up in price since 2020, but I know one thing that hasn't, and that is the membership to the Patreon and to the Substack to support this show. The people who are signed up over there as paid subscribers, as my thank you to them, they can get things like t-shirts from the choralosophy.com shop. They can also get access to my Google folder of teaching materials that I've talked about on the show for over the years. And of course, they just want to help make sure that this show can continue. And one of those benefits is a shout out on the show. Shout outs for the Inner Circle and producer tiers over on Patreon. We have Brian Long, Chandler Smith, Venture Studios, David Kowalczyk, Kyle Peterson, Max Jackson, Michael Herron, Rebecca Chalk, and Steve and Kathy Kakachik. Everybody, I am here with Shruthi Rajasekar, and we are going to be talking about a variety of things related to the language of music coming from a variety of cultural backgrounds. We're going to be talking about making music that has a thematic content or context, addressing social issues, just the process of a composer, and this is an episode that will fit inside of our Oxford University Press series. And I'm really excited to speak with Shruthi, so welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
This is going to be fun. Why don't you start out by just sharing with a little bit with the audience about who you are professionally. So what do you do every day? What hats do you wear? How would you describe yourself professionally to folks?
I am a composer performer. That's probably the hyphenate I would use just in terms of where my time is spent at this current moment. So about 70% of my time is spent composing, 20% of my time is spent performing, and then the rest is spent teaching too as well. So I am trained as a Carnatic musician, which is South Indian classical music. I grew up in that world. My mother is a famous Carnatic music practitioner, so I was really lucky to be born into that environment. But then I grew up here in the US, so of course, I was exposed to American idioms of music, and I joined the school choir. I was by that point already performing Carnatic music. I really had no idea what choir involved. I thought it was maybe the same style of singing, which it generally is not. So I had a wonderful journey with amazing teachers who were willing to bring me along in that and get my, say, sight reading up to speed and all of those things. And so when I first entered college at that point, I was singing Western classical music at a very serious level as a soloist, as well as in choral contexts. But I think throughout all of this, I was composing because composing was the way that I could create repertoire that spoke to both of these cultural and musical identities. So as I continued in my studies, composing became that space for me to express my identity. And so I still perform in both traditions whenever I can. I still write music for myself to perform, and I love to teach, especially I teach Carnatic music to students, but I also, of course, do guest lectures and such on my work. But I think I like having all of these different hats because it allows me to, again, just tap into all the different parts of my musical and cultural identity.
That's awesome. Now, I'm curious too, when you say you are a performer, when you perform, do you perform Carnatic stuff mostly? Do you still do both? Western classical and Carnatic?
Yeah, I still do both. So I have been, for certain compositions that call for the Carnatic soloist, I have been that soloist. It's sometimes expedient if I'm already there to coach from the composing side to also join as the performer. I also do love performing other people's repertoire when it comes to new music. I think it keeps me sharper as a musician to be wearing that performer hat for new music at large. And I have been, the soloist for whenever I have time for, certain masses or something as well too. So vocally, there are actually two different registers for me mostly. That Carnatic music lives kind of, let's say, E3 to maybe D5. And I'm a soprano in Western classical music. So much higher. So it's interesting because I think there are only a few of us who do both of them at that professional level. But for most artists, they overlap a lot more than it does for me. For some reason, the registers are quite different.
That's interesting. And so then composition-wise, do you have a particular medium that attracts most of your attention? Do you write for voice only? Do you write for voices and instruments? Talk to us about that.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think I had a natural segue into choral composing because it was my choir directors who took that time to explain to me like how I could bring this compositional interest I was showing. But I'm the daughter of an instrumentalist. I also grew up a little bit in the new music scene of the Twin Cities, which is where I'm originally from. And specifically, it was like jazz musicians and new music artists who tended to be instrumentalists in both of those genres were the ones who were interested in Indian music at that time, especially. Now today we have a lot of conductors who are programming music from all over. And I think choral groups in general are the ones interested in new music at that educational level. Choral and band world, I would say, especially. In orchestral world, it's happening a little more slowly there. So in that sense, they were willing to read through the things I was writing as a high schooler, my directors. That's so special. But when it comes to improvising and being open-minded in that way, I think idioms like jazz instrumental music or new music chamber ensembles that are instrumental have always had that culture of experimentation. So today, I would say probably a little more than half of my projects are vocal in nature, a cappella, vocal choral works, or works for solo voice. But I do write a lot of instrumental music also because of that grounding again. I learned about a clarinet not from the school band, but because an amazing clarinet player was jamming with my mother in our basement. So I got this hands-on knowledge, which was really cool. But it also means that I learned about things kind of out of order. Like I learned Western music theory a lot later than other composers. But that's because I had Indian music theory from the age of 4 or 5. So yeah, so it's all very patchwork, my education is what I'm saying.
Yeah. Now, this is really interesting for me to hear about this right now because, in fact, by the time the audience hears this conversation that we're recording, they will have just heard a conversation that I will have released in the past. I don't know. We're in the, you understand what I mean? With a young woman who is also a Carnatic trained vocalist who then learned Western music theory later. And she's actually a high school student. And I had her,
okay.
I interviewed her because she's in a high school choir. And I was just fascinated with, because of course I've actually never taught anyone that meets that description. Where I live, it's not as common. So I was just curious I have a question brewing here. Don't worry. When I was speaking with her, one of the things that she seemed to feel that oral upbringing with the music actually made it relatively easy for her to shift over to the Western classical notation and reading the music because she had really developed that oral sense first. Is that something you experienced as well, or was it a big roadblock? How would you describe that process for you?
Yeah, that's a great question. Let me just ask you a follow-up. Is this student also composing, or is this from like the performer perspective?
Just from a performer perspective, primarily. I think she is starting to dabble in composing.
That's exciting to hear.
Only 18.
Yeah. And that journey might pivot and change too. From what I've seen of I've been in choirs with other Carnatic musicians, although it's getting more and more common, but you're right that it's still like we're just on that precipice right now. And when I was in choir, I think I was the only, like when I was in high school, for example, I think I was the only Carnatic musician in my class or in my all-state choir. I think though what I've seen and what we've like exchanged notes on other professionals in the field is that there's a specific thing, the oral training, specifically the swara jnanam is what we call it. So swara is the word for note. Sometimes in some traditions like Hindustani, we might call that sargam. So if you hear sargam or swara, those are very similar. But it really translates as notes. Sometimes we translate it to mean solfege. I think solfege is not even an all-encompassing enough definition because we only have swara. We don't have really ABCs or anything like that. So it all comes back to this is a drone-based musical system. So we sing to the tambura or the tanpura, which is establishing the tonic for us. And that actually is called Shruti, that basis of music. So I have a musical mom, right? So she gave me a musical name. So my name means pitch. It means like to sing in Shruti means to sing in tune, to sing, to find out which pitch you're singing in, like not the key, but which tonic you're singing in. You'll say my Shruti is XYZ. So the tonic is so important that it supersedes like piece to piece. So not only do you not change the tonic within a piece, you don't change the tonic, more or less you don't change the tonic in the entire concert. So the whole process and the whole relationship to tonic is so deep because of this. So what happens for a vocalist is that I just started a new student last week. And I sat down with him and we figured out what his range roughly is at this point. And keep in mind that he's new. As he develops his voice, that hopefully that range will grow. And that's what we're hoping to, not that the range will grow, but that he'll be able to harness the highs and lows of it more. But I sat with him and I figured out, okay, this is roughly his register. So therefore, I'm going to choose a tonic for him, for his voice at this moment. And that will be his tonic until something drastically changes in his voice. That's basically his tonic, basically for life, we might say. And this is someone whose voice has broken too. So it's interesting that like it's a completely different system in that way. So what happens then is if you always have the same tonic, if you always have the same do, then your relationship to that do is it's like a best friend at that point. Yeah. And I think it certainly develops for a lot of people. I have perfect pitch, but I think it also develops a really strong sense of relative pitch because if you're every day you're turning on the drone and it's always on that do, I mean, it's probably going to become a muscle memory thing at some point. But what it certainly does is if you're singing something like a passage of Handel that is very sequential in nature and you have each note is moving, it's like a stepwise change within each phrase, let's say, each 16th note phrase. And then you're very quickly able to, you're not thinking intervallically so much as you're thinking scale degrees.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Now, where this can get a little complicated is when your choral piece modulates, because then you don't have the same saw anymore, or that's what we call our do. And so when that saw has changed, the first few times I encountered it, I was like, what is this blasphemy? What is going on? But what I've heard from other singers, and I probably do this too, is that they're able to be relative with it. That's what the choral training has taught them to integrate a relative tonic for. So that's why like Baroque music in general, I think is useful for us, because for a period of time, you're probably going to have a very clear tonic as opposed to, say, Romantic era music, where that's going to be modulating a lot.
Yeah. Yeah, that's fascinating to me because I'm kind of an early Western music nerd, and that was my research focus when I was in graduate school. And that concept you mentioned of like maybe even not changing the tonic for the whole concert, that actually was Western for a long time too.
Yes.
And what really changed that was the invention of well-tempered instruments.
Yes.
Because, back if you go back far enough in Western, I guess you could say classical music, even though it was pre-classical, you would also have entire programs where the tonic didn't change. Because of course there were practical acoustical reasons for that back then. And once you get the piano invented and you can play, equally out of tune in all keys, like I like to say, then that changed. That's really an interesting a little crossover of history that I had never really thought about before. So I have a question slightly changing our direction just a little bit, but I'm making some assumptions now just from hearing your story that part of what got you into music in the first place was having a famous music mom. But every kid, my mother was a music teacher as well. So I had music. My grandmother was a piano professor. So it was ingrained in me, probably like it was ingrained in you. However, I have my own connection, my own stories to where the spark finally hit for me personally, because I'm not my mom and I'm not my grandma. So I'm assuming that you have those too. What were the sparks as for young Shruthi of like, hey, I'm going to do music too?
That's a great question, and I'm looking forward to. I hope you're going to tell me your sparks next. That's what I'm waiting for.
I can, sure, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, especially you're third generation, so that's really, really exciting. Yeah, because I have an older brother, and he's a professor of sociology, and he is very intensely musical. Somebody who was really, really gifted, could kind of play anything back that he heard. Very annoying, one of those people. Yes, I think, why the choice to go into music is different, or even to choose to fall in love with it, right? I think that's what we're speaking about. There are a couple clear memories for me. I do remember that I went along with my mother to a lot of rehearsals when I was a kid, and not just pure music, but she was making music for theatrical and dance productions. So I think that lit the creative fire early on. I remember I was given a keyboard when I was 5 or 6 years old, and I didn't yet know, I didn't know how to think intervallically. So I didn't understand why the black notes were giving me a pentatonic scale and the white notes on their own were giving me like the Ionian mode or the major scale. I didn't understand why that might be. But I remember being fascinated by that and playing around with it before I started taking lessons, playing with it as like a site of invention. And I also remember DJing on it too. So this was all a little bit different from my mother's Indian classical world. And she's a very creative musician anyway. And she would, like I was saying, she would collaborate with different genres. But I think getting to explore on my own, I think that's probably the best gift that she gave me. Was everything in my music journey was my own drive. So I studied Indian music primarily with her, as well as I took a few lessons with her gurus in India too. But she was very clear that in that role, she is the guru, not the parent. And as such, she never told me to practice. And looking back, I kind of wish she had, because I probably would have progressed faster. I mean, I was such a lazy kid.
We all love to travel with our students, but we definitely don't love planning a trip. I know I've been there as the point person for details, and it is a nightmare. Forms, payments, fundraising, it's a never-ending task that takes away from doing what we love. That's where Kaleidoscope Adventures comes in. They've been planning performance trips for more than 30 years and handle all the details from start to finish. And one of the best parts about Kaleidoscope, they have crowdfunding options for every traveler. Contact Kaleidoscope Adventures at mykatrip.com to find out how they can take your travel beyond expectations.
So I think, it took a lot of motivation for me to learn to build that discipline myself. And that extended, I was learning piano eventually too, and she didn't tell me to practice that either. She was like, if you want to do this, you really have to choose it. But that required me to figure out, it's not just something that's around me and that I'm kind of good at, so I can find my way in it. I actually love this. I feel like I can express myself in all these ways that are so important for children to have access to ways of diving into things and being allowed to play, right? It was part of my play world, the music. I would write a little song. I would pretend I was heartbroken. I'd never known what that was at age 8, but I'd heard songs on the radio talking about it. So I'd write some imitation of that. And then I'd go jump on the trampoline. Like it was part of the fun time for me, basically. And I think that's why I've spoken to other kids of musicians, and sometimes it can become a bit of a you have to do thing or an expectation. And I think that makes it harder. So for me, it was always part of the play world. And that just continued. I'm still playing today. So that's my story. Now I'm curious to know, when did you fall in love with music? Was it an ongoing falling in love journey for you?
Yeah, so it's funny. I loved music in a sense that as a kid, in the sense that I was good at it and it got me attention and it got girls to think I was cute.
Oh no.
That's about it, honestly, until college. So I loved it, like, just because I was curious about it, and it gave me a sense of like, hey, this is something I'm good at, and I felt like it gave me a place to belong in school. But as far as falling in love with it as a career passion, I just didn't think a whole lot about that as a kid, because I was also into other things. Sports were a big deal for me, baseball and football, and primarily. And then in college, I had an opportunity to go study marketing or music. I had almost full ride scholarships for both. And I ended up choosing music, partly because my mother, who was a music teacher, passed away when I was 18.
I'm so sorry.
And so going off to college, that kind of tipped the needle for me. That was kind of my way to stay connected to my mom. And so I chose music, but I still didn't really know what I wanted to do with it. It was just, well, they're giving me money to go sing, so I'll go sing. And it wasn't until probably, I think, maybe third year into my undergrad in vocal performance that I took a class, just really, it was a filler class for an elective that I needed, which was Intro to Music Education, which I had no intention of doing at that time. And one of the projects that we had to do was go find a local high school or middle school or whatever, and find a kid there who maybe can't afford voice lessons or has never done them before. The teacher can connect you, and we're supposed to teach an 8-week sequence of lessons, and then like basically write a report on our experience, essentially.
Okay.
And during that project, I fell in love with it. I was passionate about something really for the first time related to music, because I started to see the look on this 11th grade tenor's face when I was helping him make noises with his body that he had never done before. And of course, now I look back on it, I had no business teaching voice lessons. I should not have been doing that. But it dawned on me, like, during that process, somebody would pay me to do this, like, every day. Like I could do this. And I went back immediately after that class was done, and I switched my major to music ed, and I've never looked back.
Wow. Oh my goodness. So it's interesting because both your mom and your grandma were teachers too, not just musicians.
Right. Yep.
But that wasn't part of your thinking when you went in.
No. I just had never I had never been able to see myself doing that. And so I think that just had more to do with my personality as kind of a dreamer. I was never really in the moment, and always thinking about the other things to try. And so but that's finally what grabbed me during that time. So yeah, thanks for asking. I appreciate that. I'm actually not even sure I've told that story on the show ever.
Wow.
I've been doing the show for 7 years, so I'm not sure or not. That's great. So, okay. So I have a question now for you about your music. And since this is a mostly choir people that listen to this show, let's say we're talking about a piece of Shruthi's choral music. How's the process go? Like, what is the inspiration? Where does that come from? Do you start with text? Do you start with a commission? Do you start kind of out of your own little play sandbox of ideas? Like, how does that work for you?
Yeah, these are all great questions. I guess these days, almost everything I write is commissioned, but I'm really lucky to be working with collaborators, many of whom, some of them come with themes, and that's sometimes really great to have. A theme gives you kind of a starting place. And then I also have, I think, equal number of projects where it's like, kind of write whatever you want and we'll work on it. So I'm very, very fortunate to have that too. So in terms of where I began, I take inspiration from a lot of places. I am at heart an improviser. That's born out of Carnatic music as an improvising tradition, and we really encourage our performers to do that. And I like to also make music that allows, when possible, performers to be co-creating the work with me too, because I know what it's like as a performer. I find it exciting to get that chance to improvise. It's both terrifying and exciting, right? So I try to create spaces for that. So within the composing process, I think that means I might be, once I get some spark of something, maybe I read a line of text somewhere, maybe I'm just journaling and kind of doing a free write of some kind, morning pages style. that will translate into perhaps at the piano, figuring out what the sound world is for that piece. I also really like to take walks and sing into my phone. And even if I'm not writing for choir, I'm using my voice as my instrument. But if I'm writing for choir, I definitely am using my voice as my instrument. So I'm that person who's testing out every line too. Like, no piece ever goes out that I haven't sung through everything, even if I have to do an octave shift for the bass 2 part. But I'm lucky that I also have kind of a large range, so I can usually cover tenor to soprano in my voice naturally. And so I guess my workspaces include, like, I love having blank paper, just like blank printer paper, where I will write things down. I will draw structure maps. I sometimes put it into non-musical terms. I can, like, what is the shape of this moment, this minute here? Like, what's happening? Like, maybe make a little graph of where time is the x-axis and maybe intensity is the y-axis. I also will work in Logic or some kind of DAW like that as a workspace sometimes too, if I really need to almost mock up the idea for myself. That's that oral training too. And I will use manuscript notation paper too, but probably only bits and pieces there. There are a few pieces I've written recently that have, I've written the whole thing out on paper. But for the most part, it's kind of a mix of these workspaces. My phone is another workspace, of course, the voice memo app. When I had written my 45-minute choral orchestral work, I had, I think, 300 voice memos for that project. So, and that was a lot of little bits to figure out, okay, how does this all fit together? But I think it's in general an act of zooming in and zooming out. So like when I say zooming in, like figuring out like 2 measures, it might take me a week to figure out. But then I'm also always thinking about the big picture. So that for me is really important. What is the sound world? What sounds are part of this and what sounds are not part of this? And that's what we're embarking upon each time with the new composition.
Yeah. Now, how much of your new compositions or how much of your compositions would you say have either implicit or explicit Carnatic content in them?
Great questions. Implicitly, I would say 100%, in the sense that my thinking process is like a hybridized musical language. I think in swara, that word for the Indian notes, and I think in like straight, like, I don't know, octatonic scale, if that's what's in the piece, for example. And an octatonic doesn't actually map on well to Indian music. So that's always exciting for me when I'm working in a one that doesn't map on well. If I'm working on something really chromatic, for example, which I like to do too. But it's like a back and forth. Or it's not even a back and forth. I think I live in both at the same time. But I will say the explicit is less so, in the sense that I have pieces that feel like Heart of Earth, for example, which is in the Oxford series, which is part of that Accessible and Beautiful anthology that they have. And it's being performed in schools as well as outside of schools. That piece is very Indian to me because it's got that tonic, it's all, the G is the tonic, it stays in that. It has kind of idiomatic slides, like it has sort of folky like slides, but I could easily put that into a Carnatic raga and completely map it onto that. It has like an inherent cross rhythm in the rhythm of it, but the time signature stays the same. And that's also a pretty Indian kind of thing, to have subdivisions that are complex, but the overall big beat stays the same. But it's in English, it doesn't have any, so the text doesn't have any content about Indian music or Indian identity at all. It's about farmers markets and imagery about nature, this beautiful poetry by Minnesotan poet Laura Purdy Salas, who is local to my community. So when she talks about a farmer's market, it's my farmer's market, that kind of thing. It has a clapping in it, so one could make the argument that that's like thalam, which is the way we count rhythm in Indian music. But again, on the surface of it, I doubt that anyone would see any of that as explicitly Indian, which I think is like the beauty of so many immigrants or new American stories anyway, is that...
That's funny. I was thinking that exact thing when that's interesting. Okay, go ahead.
Because it's like, yes, there are times where I post a photo of myself and I'm in my Indian garb, and it's very obvious that that's what I'm performing. But just like every other American in this country, I just sometimes want to be seen for me. The insides of my hearts, the philosophies I believe in, my values. And so it's always there, and it's often never there, that expression of identity. And I love to play with that, with the music that I write.
That's really interesting. And I love that. That's beautiful. So is it possible to write music for a choir that is authentically Carnatic?
This is a brilliant question, because I have written many works that involve, say, Carnatic musicians performing in them, which is probably as authentic as you can get. But what does it mean to capture Carnatic music authentically? Well, it's what you find on a Carnatic music stage, which doesn't involve multiple voices usually singing together. There are more than a couple choirs that have been there or are arising in Carnatic music contexts, which is usually people singing in unison as an ensemble, but singing together, or even maybe you might say heterophony at the heart of it, because they might have slightly different gamakam, that's the word for the ornamentations happening. I have a work called Ganam, which I wrote as my senior thesis in college. And I was really grateful that the choir I was part of, the Princeton University Glee Club, premiered this work with Gabriel Crouch, conductor. And I have had it won an award later and was performed by another wonderful ensemble, but I made the decision soon after that to not publish this work. And I've had that thought for 5 or 6 years now. Maybe I'll change my mind on this in the future. But that work, I believe, requires weeks and weeks of immersive time spent with a Carnatic musician to really create those gamakams, to really make the voice bend like that. And some might argue that weeks and weeks is not enough even for that, that you can get a close imitation, but it's still not the thing. And even with that work, which uses the Raga Kalyani, which is the equivalent of the Lydian mode, authentically, it has these gamakams. Even with that work, what's called the alapana at the beginning, which is the improv, there's two things about it. First of all, it's all scripted out. So it's not an improv because it takes years and years to learn what is allowed grammatically in that improv and what isn't, the rules of the raga. So I've scripted it out. So it's actually not an alapana. It just has the feeling of one, the timing of it and such. And secondly, almost like immediately in the piece, when you have a traditional alapana, you have the main artist and the accompanying melodic artist is following the phrases. And they happen at like a distance. Now it's following at pitch, but mine is at the fifth, which is immediately for, you said in your early music fan, right? That sets up conventions of counterpoint from a Renaissance-based tradition onwards. So that's my invention. That's my imagination there. Is that authentically Carnatic? Well, not in today's Carnatic world. Maybe 50 years from now, Carnatic music, it's not a static tradition. Maybe that will become the norm to imitate at the fifth as opposed to right at the pitch. But right now that's not done. So even though I have followed the rules of the raga, I haven't followed convention with the piece. And there's so many elements like that. And still with such a piece that has so much like choral stuff, so much ensemble harnessing in it, I still don't think it's a piece that can be performed willy-nilly, which is why I haven't published it yet. And like I said, I could change my mind on that, but I basically pulled it out of circulation because I felt that even to do a piece like that, you need so much time to learn how to bend your voice like that and to, when you can bend and when you can't bend. There are all these rules to it too.
Yeah.
That's a very long answer to a very short question.
Oh, it's great. And I was so excited that you didn't think it was a dumb question that I forgot my other question, but
it's a great question.
Yeah. So, and because the reason I thought of that question is because I know that, or I feel that American choral musicians are quite frequently, when we do music that is from cultures that are less familiar to us, and of course for every American choral music, Americans are very diverse as well. That style might not be the same for everyone. We all have certain types of styles that we're more familiar to or familiar with. But when we are pursuing those styles that are not super familiar to us, I feel like we're encouraged to chase the dragon, so to speak, of authenticity, and especially even and possibly even into ways that are not possible. So that's why I was curious about your take on that. For example, there are I've heard some people make the argument that in African American gospel music tradition, it's very difficult even to do that music authentically once you leave church, because that's where it comes from. And if it isn't being done with that religious fervor, then it is no longer authentic. Some would disagree with that, of course, and and that's okay. But I even think about things like, how would we authentically sing a piece of country music with a choir? Well, I don't know that that's possible, but it doesn't mean that no one should arrange that. So that's kind of where I'm thinking. my thought is.
Yes, so for me as a composer, after having going on this journey with this particular work, which I love dearly, and I love the two performances that happened, I started to consider, so what is my role in this? Is it my goal to set an impossible standard? Or is it more interesting for me, especially if I love to collaborate with people and to actually bring the music to life and not just write something theoretical, but write something real? This is the path I took. The second option of, well, maybe let me think about how I write what I write. It's also more interesting for me to think about, what does that mean to bring aspects of the tradition to people, but to do it in a way that not only makes it approachable, but reimagines what those aspects are. And so it's not only about making it available to performers, but it also makes it interesting for me as a composer. Like, it sets a new creative challenge. And that's my way of looking at it. I think every creator has a different take on this. So mine is very much specific to me. But a simple thing is, I don't often use Carnatic ragas that are very, very difficult or require lots and lots of knowledge to sing. I'll give you an example, like the raga Thordi. I don't know if you're a mode person, but you mentioned early music, so I'm sticking in there. So the raga Thordi, which is a very important Carnatic raga, and just a FYI to any listeners, it's different from Hindustani Thordi. It's same name, but different raga. So this one is the Phrygian mode, technically, on paper. So is it okay if we do some singing on the podcast?
Go for it.
Great. Sa re ga ma pa da ni sa ni da pa ma ga re sa. Now, Thordi is never sung, or rarely sung, like that. It is sa re ga ma pa da ni sa ni da pa ma ga re sa. And that's just one way of doing the arohanam, avarohanam, the scale. There are many, many treatments for the different notes, and which context are you in, and which part of the range are you singing in the upper half of the scale. You're going to sing it differently. Thordi is a raga that allows you to skip some of the notes. I mean, there's so much. That's why it's a major raga. People will improvise for an hour in a concert. It's possible to do that. So If I then hand that to a choir and say, have at it, there are so many questions, right? Like, how do I notate that? Am I notating that? Am I just providing audio guides? And if so, how am I breaking that down to make it available, right? So it's not that I'm saying, okay, I will never write in Thordi in my life again. But that's not the case. I have accessed the Phrygian mode and done so in certain pieces. But I think for myself, it becomes more interesting to think, okay, what can I do with what's sort of like, if someone sets me a theme, that has limited my options technically on paper, but sometimes it's more interesting because you can get more specific with it, right? Than if you don't have that parameter. So it can open up a whole new world what does Thordi sound like when you're accessing it harmonically, right? As opposed to just thinking of it as the melodic complications of that's very different from, but on paper, that's what we call that ga, so it's a whole new world that can be accessed instead of thinking of it as a limitation. Okay, choirs can't sing those gamakams without extensive training. Okay, but what can we do? There's a lot that we can actually make happen.
Sure. Yeah. And finding the sweet spot that is accessible to an American choir or to a choir in general. Is that kind of what you're getting at, is just figuring out where that happy medium is between authenticity and doable?
I think so. And it doesn't mean not setting challenge. I mean, I think a lot of people would say that a lot of my pieces are quite challenging. But the other piece for OUP, Bahari Barish, is an example of this kind of question. Bahar is a raga that's there in Carnatic music and South Indian classical music, but also primarily in Hindustani music, which is also a tradition I've been fortunate to learn a little bit about in my journey. Bahar, unlike Thordi, this raga I just sang, Bahar's gamakams are considered more accessible, even within the tradition. It has those same curves and dips that I was doing, but they're shaped in a way that's considered more accessible. And so, okay, let's create a complicated piece in Bahar. It's one reason it's more accessible is that it has fewer number of options of how you can treat a certain scale degree. Like with Thordi, you could do 3-4 treatments of one note, and you have to know which context calls for which one. But in Bahar, it's going to be probably the same motion with your voice. So it is a learning experience for the choir to learn how to move their voice that way. And there's a whole guide there's like a 40-minute guide to go with this. But then once you do learn how to make that motion, it's something you can bookmark and keep practicing throughout the piece because it doesn't change. So that's where I'm thinking, okay, that's a creative kind of solution to the situation.
Right. Yeah, that's really interesting. Now, your pieces then, in addition to having that influence of your musical languages, and I'll say that plurally, what are they about? Like, do you gravitate towards certain themes in your texts, or are you all over the map? How would you describe that to us?
To sum it up very quickly, I'm the kind of person who sends like 14-minute voice messages to my friends.
Okay.
Which is to say that I have a lot to say, that I probably think too deeply about a lot of things. But that's definitely a boon as a creator because it means endless sources of inspiration.
So we're going to be best friends then.
Are you a long voicemail person? Do you like
I'm just,
the voicemail?
well, I know because I have this podcast. You could just consider, I get to vent through to thousands of people here. So that's how it, and so I can get away with that, but not in the sense that I overthink. Everyone who knows me really well, I overthink everything.
I think it's a great thing for creatives and artists, right? That means
Right.
we just have endless questions to ask in our career, in our journey. So that doesn't mean I don't write about the mundane or the simple. I just finished writing a set of children's songs with my mother, which was such a joy to work with her because she's a composer too and an amazing educator. So her way of thinking is so creative. But one of our songs is about mangoes, right? So it's not about always solving the world's problems. But actually, the last line of that mango poetry, which is like it's a traditional text we set, it says, when we eat the mango, let's split it evenly and eat it. And so I had so much fun putting together a program note for that because I was like, this is even in this little thing that's like, mangoes taste so sweet. Mangoes are from this place. You got to try this mango, that mango. That's what the text means. But the last line is still about like egalitarian societies or aspiring towards it. And let's teach children to split the mango evenly. Just because I found it doesn't mean I'm not going to share it. So I think what it is, maybe this is the same thing for you, is willing to see depth and beauty in any text we encounter and any idea we encounter, even something as simple as the mango song can have meaning and we can teach values while we're doing it. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I think that's my philosophy, and I read a lot, so that makes its way into my work. I have one piece it's not only is it poetry from a full novel, like the text is taken from a novel, I took it from 3 different novels. It's a 6-minute piece, and it has text from a novel by each of the Bronte sisters.
Okay.
And so, collecting the quotes for that was a very, very long process. Now, I know they're writing really well, but I went through with a highlighter reading these books of which ones did I really want. What was I trying to say with this when I was doing this kind of collage of text from each of these books? Mm-hmm. And trying to find the central themes and in each of their works, that the ways that they intersected with each other. And that was a really, really, really fun one to write because it's all about standing as an individual in tension with community. And I think choirs represent that, right? You as a conductor know when you're standing at the front of the room, if one person is absent, it completely changes the sound of the ensemble.
Sure.
But when you are standing on the other side of that, you're in the choir, sometimes you feel lost in the crowd. Sometimes you feel like it doesn't matter if you don't sing, especially if you're in a high school choir and there's all these other things going on, dynamics, group dynamics, hormones, what have you. So I wanted to write something that made people feel like they're valued as individuals in a choir. And this work goes on a wild journey. There's a point where everybody is supposed to sing their own pitch. And there's this whole thing of like, what does group think versus individual think, etc. And so, of course, I needed the Brontes for that. They've written so passionately about topics like that.
Would you say that your texts that you end up choosing are kind of an equal representation of that tension between the individual human experience and the political, the societal? Or would you say you lean one direction? Like, do you prefer kind of to make a political statement versus a personal one? How do you feel it ends up in the wash when your music comes out?
Great question. When it comes to conversations and dialogues and political conversations, now particularly, there's this feeling that words are direct. You can yell at someone anonymously in the online comments until the cows come home, right? You can have a YouTube fight we've all been witness to this. Hopefully we've not participated in this, but it's...
As a content creator, I will tell you it's my whole existence. So yes,
yeah.
Very aware.
And hats off on keeping your equilibrium through that, because it's a lot. I think it's good that people feel comfortable in a way speaking their truth. I want to call that out. And at the same time, when you are just a person, but you've become like a symbol of something, that's also a lot to sort through as the creator. That being said, though, I think setting text specifically reminds us that words can be colored in so many ways. And that is what's like, we fundamentally, I think, forget when it comes to sparring about any political matter or even about the politicians that we have. And it's like, oh my God, they said this today. But it's like, well, when we take it out of context, there's so much that can be done with the interpretation. That's why we have these machines that are the media machines on every side of the spectrum, putting it out in this way, right? And so what I love so much about being a musician and specifically being a choral composer is the opportunity to explore the colors. That's what music gives us. It gives us the chance to basically do the shading. And even within that, there's a spectrum we can convey, right? You can ask your choir to sing it with this kind of expressivity, with this kind of tone, be angry with it, be intense with it, be excited with it, be happy with it. There's so much we can do as performers to yet another layer of interpretation. But I think that's what I see myself as in that composer role, especially with texts on topics like this, these important topics, is I'm in that interpretive chair. And the last thing that I think that music does is it gives nuance, when so often we're missing nuance. It gives that gray space. I've had works that are deeply political, and I've met audience members who are not probably voting the same way I am, who don't feel the same way about certain issues. But when we come together in that space, it is a very fragile space, and it's for a very short while, right? It's not like, I don't know that they leave the concert completely changed or that I leave the concert changed by them entirely. But for that brief amount of time, we are willing to hold space with people who potentially have different views and who are potentially not people we would otherwise spend our time with. And as we get more and more into the spaces where we are spending time only with people we like, and I'm not going to say that that's a wrong thing. There's a reason why a safe space exists, right? Sometimes it's for a safety kind of reason. But there is something valuable, I think, about that concert space still, because at least with, where we are in this current moment, this could change in a year's time, but you know that you're going to be safe enough. There are enough conventions and rules in that you don't expect a complete chaotic situation to evolve, a violent situation to evolve there. But it still gives us space to not only dig into important topics, but to do it as a community, audience and performers combined. And that to me feels sacred, especially in this day and age.
Yeah, I agree so wholeheartedly. In fact, here's an interesting way to think of it. In which scenario am I more likely to encounter a verbal altercation over a statement that I make about something that I hold as a political value or a social value, right? If I simply type it onto Facebook and hit send or hit publish, or if I'm performing it in a choral concert in another, right? So obviously in a choral concert, people are going to just sit there, even if they don't agree with the message, they're going to sit there in that moment and they're going to take it in. They're going to think about what's being said. They're going to reflect on it. They're going to have their own thoughts and agreements or disagreements, but they're going to just sit there in that moment and be present with it. On Facebook, you just either fight back or you scroll on. Yes. You don't have that moment of reflection. And I let me just say, I think that doing it in a choral concert is better than doing it on Facebook for that reason. Is that kind of what you're getting at as far as the music can give these nuanced perspectives, or just feel free to react to that however you want.
Yeah, I think that's a really important thing, that you are forced to sit with that truth for a while. I think that's why it's also, I personally as a creator, when possible, enjoy having, say, a talk back or something afterwards, so that it's not just going from, if this is the stage, this direction to this one, that we can receive back. But the important thing about receiving people's responses is that they've had time to digest, at least they've had some percentage of the time we've had in rehearsal putting something together, right? Or I've had as composer to through the course of that hour or whatever it is, they've had time to mull on it, at least to some degree, so that we've had the time to mull on it when we've chosen the pieces or when we've created the pieces. And so as opposed to what you're talking about, which is that instant reaction, which we are also trigger ready, right, for that, because we're constantly in that battle mode. It feels like, and I don't think that's probably just now, right? I'm guessing the 1960s were like that too, or certain spaces. I mean, there are just times where it's been like you've had to be at the ready to fight, but like, my goodness, what does that do to the endocrinology of your body? I don't know. I think the second thing with the nuance point is, like, music isn't entirely black and white, right? And so it just gives that space to, even if I have a very clear message of what I want to say, you as performer might have a slightly different message, and you have the liberty to color it differently. I can't stop you from that. And then the audience has the ability to choose how they receive it too. So you get to humanize it, and you get to put it into your terms and your perspective. And I think that's rare, that we don't just like blast information at people and say, you have to take it in this way.
Yeah. That's fascinating. You mentioned earlier that you're a reader. Can you give us some examples of things that you read or that you would recommend that have impacted your life as an artist?
Ooh, yes. I read anything and everything, whether it's like the back of a cereal box or a bunch of novels or whatever it is. So when it comes to nonfiction, I really like to read books on craft. Those really excite me. I think a book that I tell everybody about is Art and Fear.
Okay.
Nice provocative title there. It's a really slim 100-page book, and the authors are escaping me now. Two of them, I think they might be professors, so they're writing from the perspective of being teachers as well. But it's basically about creative doubt and how do you sit with that uncomfortable feeling. And it's important to sit with it, like to not know the answer when you're starting out, right? If you knew the answer, would you make the thing already? Right. I don't know.
Yeah.
So that's what that book is about. I'm currently reading a book called The Good Enough Job, which is about workaholism in the US specifically. And so that's a fascinating one. I think it's interesting for those of us who love our work to also read books like that, to think about tempering it. I read this kind of Buddhist philosophy book recently called Don't Bite the Hook. It's basically about, is anger an immediate reaction, or is there like a moment that you pause before you have a reaction of anger? So that one is really, really good. But I also read I read thrillers, I read horror, I read fantasy, I read murder mysteries. I love murder mysteries. I read rom-coms. Like I said, if it has words on it and they're in a language I know, I'm probably going to be reading it.
That's awesome. That's very cool. Now, before we get wrap this up, let's make sure people know where to find your music. So let's start with, you mentioned a couple OUP publications already, but why don't you tell us those again and any other things we can find of yours on OUP, and then other places we can find your music as well?
Yes, absolutely. With OUP, there's a work called Heart of Earth, which is written for upper voices, as well as there's an essay bar version too. It's a kind of a 3-part. So especially for the ranges are deliberately a little bit smaller in that one. So just to make sure that everyone can sing that. There's a work called Bahari Barish, which is part of their secular a cappella series. And that one's a little more intricate. That's a 5-part piece. And then let's see, there might be a couple things in the works, but that's all I'll say at that because contracts have not yet been signed.
Okay.
And then aside from that, I have worked with a few other publishers as well as I self-publish a lot. And there are some distributors that are out there too. I think probably the most complete place is my website, which is just myname.com. There are things on YouTube. There have been some releases on Spotify and such by choirs, especially. There's a couple more coming up this month and next month from choirs in the UK. I used to live in the UK, so that's why I have a lot of projects over there, as well as choirs here in the US. Yeah, and feel free to reach out if drop a line and say hello if you'd like.
Awesome. And I will I'll put your website in the show notes as the main link to find people or to have people find stuff about you. And then of course, I did an episode already with Edrin Coleman on the accessible book there with OUP. Fantastic. And so there's a connection there that people can learn more about that project, which was, of course, for the music teacher side of me, was a passion project because that was a much needed publication, in my opinion.
Yes. And the time it came released, right, at this point with people rebuilding choirs and such. Fantastic project by Marcus and Edrin. Yeah. Yep,
that's a big deal. So Shruthi, thank you so much for being here with me for the last hour and chatting and sharing a little bit of who you are. And I hope people can get to know you and get to know your music as well. And if nothing else, I've really enjoyed this conversation. So thank you.
Thank you for having me. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for sticking around to the end of a conversation. If you are still hearing my voice, that means you're one of the MVPs, one of the diehards, one of the real ones, as the kids say. So if you are willing on the way out to check out a few different ways that you can help me continue to make this show high quality. 1, use the promo code. That's the biggest one. At Sight Reading Factory, at mymusicfolders.com, at mychoirropes.com, at graphitepublishing.com, and endeavormusicpublishing.com. All of those take the Choralosophy checkout code, and of course now the newest one is 3-Minute Theory. You can get a 15% discount when you enter Choralosophy at checkout there. And of course, going to Apple Podcasts and leaving a positive review is very helpful there, and sharing the episodes to your colleagues in real life and on social media. All of those things are incredibly helpful and allow me to continue to create this resource for you. Thank you so much for tuning in. We'll see you next time.